Hello, this is Susan Garrett.
And Sarah Fernandez-Lopez.
You're listening to Bad Dog Agility, where the naughty dogs play.
All right, today we have a very special guest on the podcast. We have Susan Garrett joining us of Say Yes Dog Training. Welcome to the podcast, Susan.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here.
So Susan really needs no introduction. She is a world-famous trainer and competitor, has won the national championships in 2 different countries at every single jump height there is. So many other things we couldn't possibly list them.
They don't need to hear it. That's not why they're tuning in anyway, Sarah.
That's right. So let's start by talking about dog training in general. So what guides you in your dog training? So what inspires your training these days?
For my own personal training, I'm a person who always likes to improve. So no matter where I am, like in my own life, I'm always challenging myself to get better. And when I look at my dogs, whenever I bring a new puppy along, I always want to improve something that the last dog did. So that drives me in my own dog training. And then, certainly since I've been teaching and doing seminars all over the world, I really want to help people. And so I really want to find a way to change the life of every dog worldwide so that all dogs are trained in a way that's reinforcing and develops this amazing relationship. So really recently I'm just driven by that mantra to change the life of dogs and dog owners worldwide.
Well, certainly, especially with the online training that is just completely blossomed over the last couple of years, not just for you, but for many, many trainers. You're really reaching a lot of people with things like recallers and stuff like that. So really making good on that goal.
Thank you, Sarah.
Of yours. So positive training in dog training certainly continues to grow in popularity. People are becoming more and more aware of positive methods. And you've been really a proponent of positive methods all the way back to Shaping Success, which I remember reading about your dog Buzz and about the struggles that you had teaching a difficult dog using purely positive methods, and how it wasn't always easy, but it was something that you really believed in, and so you continued to stick with it. How long ago was that book written?
Well, the original articles in the framework was when Buzzy was a puppy, so more than 17 years ago.
Right, so that's a long time that you've been really pushing this concept of positive reinforcement training. So what are some of the changes that you've seen over these 17 years in positive training and its adaptation in dog training in general?
Well, certainly, I'm not the first. I'm just following the footsteps of some amazingly great people that have mentored me. People like Bob and Marion Bailey, who have just been awesome and really gave me a great insight into training using positive reinforcement as your foundation. Early on with Buzzy, I did a lot with a clicker, and I realized that a clicker is a great tool. Excuse me. A clicker is a great tool that you should use specifically when you need it for something that's very precise. So I certainly don't use a clicker nearly as much. The other thing, there wasn't anybody for me to model my training after that was doing performance sports back then, that was training this way. So there was always an unknown. And that's the difference for me, that I know no matter what it is I'm going to train my dog to do, I can get there using reinforcement-based training. So the unknown is gone. And of course, all the naysayers that, so I would listen to my videos of Buzz when he was early at ringside. You'd hear people saying, oh, that positive stuff's not going to work for this dog. And you'd question it, right? So certainly the confidence to know that we're on the right track. Buzzy, unfortunately, he got the brunt of me not knowing what I was doing, and so I use more punishment in the form of timeouts. And today, what I recognize is that the more you know about what motivates your dog, what they find reinforcing in, and how to control access to that reinforcement, the less you need to use punishment of any kind.
Right.
So that's the big, for me, what I see, and certainly you see more and more trainers and more modalities embracing using reinforcement as the focus of their training.
Right. So we've discussed in past podcasts this idea that agility trainers specifically benefit a lot from positive reinforcement-based training, not just because we think it's the right thing to do for our dogs, but because of this notion of speed and confidence and how that is paramount in agility. in a way that maybe is not true with many other dog sports. Do you kind of see that too, or do you have your own thoughts on using it specifically in agility?
I think that it's hard to know, scientifically, why is agility embraced more reinforcement-based training? And you could say, well, it's because we need speed and confidence, but so do thoroughbred racehorses, and so do greyhounds, and they're not necessarily trained with only reinforcement-based programs. I think it's more the fact that agility is a relatively young sport. And we don't have those deep-seated roots that go back to a more punitive-based dog training. And so it's very, very easy to forge new ground when you're really creating new behaviors. And there isn't a history of, well, you can, I remember years ago doing a seminar in the Midwest where they trained weeples using an ear pinch, that the dog had to do it right. And so there were people trying to do a punishment-based training. But the fact is, most of us succeeding back in the 80s and the 90s were reinforcement-based trainers, and so we became the mentors that people started to follow. And of course, confidence and speed is a big, big part of agility, and luckily for our sport, it's grown in a way that, punishment is there, but it certainly isn't predominant.
Right. So we are seeing in other dog sports more people embracing the notion of positive-based training, even in sports that you wouldn't expect to see that, like Schutzen, something like that. So what do you see as the stumbling block for some of these other dog sports really embracing positive-based training?
To have success on an easy scale with reinforcement, it's really simple in that what you have, the dog wants. And so if you're training the dog to sit pretty, well, they really want the cookie, so it's easy to shape them to sit pretty. Mm-hmm. But when you go to sports like IPO or Schutzen or field work with birds, and certainly anything where the dog's drives get very, very high, what they want, what you have, can't compare to what they want.
Right.
So the drive to chase after, the predatory instinct kick in to chase after and bite somebody, the drive to flush a bird, keep your cookie.
Right.
So what the stumbling block there is the understanding that you're never going to have reinforcement that's going to trump that for a dog. But what you do have is the ability to bring that reinforcement through you as a trainer. And then you trump that reinforcement. I look at when Buzzy was young, and Buzzy was obsessed about swimming, and he would swim nonstop if you let him. And he'd get near water and he'd just tremble for the chance to go swimming. And I put it on cue that you weren't allowed to swim unless I told you could swim. And so what early on started as this obsession that I just want to swim, and I'll swim for an hour if I'm allowed to, quickly turned into permission to swim. So instead of staying in the water and swimming for an hour, he would swim and then he would come out and look at me, can you tell me I can go again? So the reinforcement of swimming went through me, therefore the game became about me. And the same would be true of these other sports, is the more reinforcing the sport is, the more brilliant you have to be at controlling access to that reinforcement and manipulating the reinforcement so it is becoming a part of doing something for me, earns the right to do that.
Right. So it's very difficult on the trainer's part in some of these other sports. And many people have said it before, agility is not really natural for dogs.
Right.
I mean, jumping is to some degree, but this idea of doing a course in a numbered order or weave pulls or something like that, it's just not, it's something that's fully taught. Whereas, like you mentioned, Schutzen and field, for example, you have a sport that's based around a natural instinct of the dog that you've got to then shape and control.
Right.
What's already there.
And when you're training a dog, you have two choices. There's punishment and there's reinforcement. And the more you do of one, the less you have to do of the other. But if you have taken reinforcement as far as you can go in your sport, and the dog's drive to you've not harnessed that drive and brought it through you, then there's nothing left for you but punishment. And that's why there is so much punishment in the other sports right now, is because that understanding of how to harness that reinforcement and bring it through you and your program and what you want. And once that kicks in, I'm hoping that we'll see that. And for me right now, the tough thing is for people to stay non-judgmental when they're looking at those other
Right.
sports, because it's emotional for those of us who love our dogs. Well, how could you do that to a dog? Well, just to encourage and support them, well, they learn this process. So it's an older sport with tradition, anchored deeply in tradition, but they're going to have to discover these new ways, harnessing reinforcement, and it's definitely possible.
Right. And like you mentioned, with agility being a young sport, and there were so many people at the top having success using reinforcement. And I think that we're seeing that emerge, maybe to a greater degree in some of these other sports. I mean, I'm not completely familiar with their history, but you have people like Michael Ellis, who's been on our podcast before, and Ivan Balabanov, both doing Schutzen, both succeeding, both using, very much reinforcement-based training. So I think we will continue to see that going forward. So, we've recently discussed the idea that a handling system is really just a consistent set of cues, and that you use with your dog on course. How has your idea of, in quotes, the system evolved over time?
I still feel very strongly that it's important to have a handling system that makes sense to you and your dog. And the word for me that has changed is the word consistent. Because for 20 years I tried to be consistent, and what I realized was there is no one who's consistent in their cues. And so the drive shouldn't be to be consistent, because you're never going to get there. The drive is to evaluate what your attempt at consistency is going to cost you. So for example, if I was working on a system that had a positional cue as I used to, then when I would drive to position and attempt to get there, but I wouldn't, then there's some dilution of understanding in my dog. So the big thing for me is to not look at the balance of consistency and attempted consistency, and try to minimize attempts and try to maximize where you can be consistent. And that's really, I still very, very strongly about that. There's still a lot of people running agility that have no kind of a system.
Right.
And that is going to be frustrating for the dog and for the handler.
Right. And that attempt consistency, there's really this idea of execution. So there is a system on paper,
right,
and then there's the system that you go out and run.
Right.
And you've got to be able to, like you said, get to those spots time and time again, because what happens on course is going to influence your dog. I mean, every moment of every day, our dogs are learning based on what goes right and what goes wrong. And so you can have it clear in your head all day long, but since you have no way to communicate to your dog other than your actions, then you can run into trouble that way.
Right. And that's why like you said, what your system is on paper and how you execute it, that's a consistency that I would look for. More so than that this is always done the same way. Look to what your intention and what you're doing are consistent. If you get consistency that way, that's far more important than consistency that I need everything to be the same. Ideally both would be the same, but that's not always going to happen. And really, for me in my handling, my goal is always to minimize the questions my dog has on course. And those questions, you're going to see them with, the most obvious is a dog taking off course, but just a dog glancing up at you. That glance is going to slow the dog down, and I just love them going as fast as they can. Right. So to minimize that confusion in the dog, and that's what the handling system that I'm looking for has always been.
So the focus really is on communication. Right. And in the past, I think we used consistency as a proxy for communication, but if you have other ways to communicate with your dog, or like you said, being consistent in how you execute, that's a way to communicate with your dog.
Absolutely.
So, speaking about systems, I guess I personally feel like several years ago, there was kind of this new notion of the system, and I would say a consolidation of systems, so that as people became aware that the system was a good thing, they started to seek out one system or another, and two or three really emerged, and people kind of split up into those camps. Yeah. And I feel like recently, and I think probably a lot of this has to do with the internet and how much everybody can see what everybody is doing all over the world. People at the highest levels who are having success with lots of different ways of running things. I feel like there's now become kind of an explosion back again, where people at the top have taken what they can from lots of different people and put together, like you said, what works for them and their dog. So it's no longer, two or three, it's, system prime, system, like just continuing little tweaks to systems as people do what works for them and incorporate other aspects of different systems. And you've been very open on your blog, writing articles about how your personal system of handling has changed. And what's really been kind of the driver behind that? You mentioned a little bit, it was the realization that maybe your execution wasn't always matching up with what you were intending. What are some of the changes that you've been making, and what's been influencing those?
Certainly that was my driver, was that my intention and my execution weren't matching up. And then the fallout from that was that I would have off courses, or I would have bars down, because my dog had those questions. Really, I started adding, for me, more verbals into my handling 10 years ago. So when Encore was a puppy, in my one jump video where I teach check, check, check and swing, those were the first two that I used consistently. And then that really evolved so that I added more and more in. And really, I wanted a way to be able to communicate to my dog what's going to happen next, while keeping my body in a consistent plane for them to understand what I want for them. And so that's just the evolution. What I'm doing today compared to what I was doing a year and a half ago might look dramatically different to somebody who is on the outside, but when you get inside, it actually hasn't changed that too terribly much. Now, people would disagree. The big difference is what you're going to see is I'm in motion. And a good friend of mine, he said to me, a friend, Adrian Rikers, who runs on our Canadian team, he said, a cement truck, once it gets stopped, it takes a lot of energy to get going again. I don't think he was trying to...
I was going to say, was he calling you a cement truck?
No,
That's not very nice.
He could have been.
Right.
But the point was very valid, that if you're running as an agility handler and you can run like the wind and you can outrun your dog, you can stop and start as many times as you want. But if that's not your forte, you got to get in motion and stay in motion. And so that's really been the driver for me, is how can I keep things consistent between what my intention is for my dog and how I'm executing, and stay in motion. Because if I can stay in motion, I had this big epiphany this year. I've said for as long as I've been in agility, Sarah, I've said, I'm a slow runner. And I realized I'm not a slow runner, I'm a slow starter.
Right.
Because once I get going, I'm not too bad.
Right.
And by staying in motion, I'm able to stay ahead of my dogs now. And when dogs that are trained the ways our dogs are, right, starting with the recallers course, it's all about chase, chase, chase. And if I can stay ahead, that chase, chase, chase translates into feature. As 6 years old is a second and a half faster to this year than she was a year ago, because I'm ahead almost 90% of the time around a course. Get in motion, stay in motion, use my verbals to cue things so that she knows what's coming up. And that's basically the overall change that's happened.
Okay. So you mentioned feature, so you are incorporating everything that you're doing back into your currently competing dogs, rather than just doing all of this point forward with swagger.
Yeah, no, and that's the really cool thing. Again, it looks dramatically different, but the foundation is very, very much the same, and there really hasn't been much that's changed in And so I could take feature and change her overnight. We went, it was 2012 when I was at the FCS championships when I made my decision. I was making a bunch of changes that would make the appearance that is very different. And blind crosses was the first one that, looks very, very different. And with feature, I always give my dogs 8 weeks off. So we went from October for FCI championships. 8 weeks off took us to around Christmas time. And I started trialing her again in, I think, January, February. At the World Championships in May, she had the fastest time in almost every class except one at the WAO Championships, and she won a number of those classes, maybe 2 classes. So the majority of the classes she ran, she had the fastest time. And that was from a dog who was running what appeared to be a completely different system.
Right.
So it really is more of an evolution than a breakaway and starting something new.
Right.
So it's just a next evolutionary step.
And, kind of going back to the very first thing that we were talking about with systems, it's all about communication. And if your communication is clear, it really doesn't matter how that communication happened, which system it was or whatever. If the dog understands it, that's all that really matters.
Exactly. And I think if it's clear, I've seen so many people embrace what we're doing. Linda Orton Hill is a great example. She can stay ahead of her dog that she's never been able to stay ahead of her dog, and it's translated last month at USDA Nationals, coming second in the Grand Prix and third in the steeplechase. So to me, that just speaks volumes that it is a system that, and I hate to use the word system because it implies a box.
Right.
And it's an ever evolving communication program, really, more than a system that stays in a box. And you can take somebody like Linda who can have success because she can get emotion to stay emotion. It works with all the dogs. I've just not seen any dog that hasn't benefited by it. Dogs who lack motivation by getting emotion and staying emotion, those dogs suddenly are having more drive around a course. Dogs that, like Swagger, who would knock bars is not going to knock bars as much because the information is so clear to him. I think Encore would have really benefited by being in running in this current program.
You definitely have a reputation for finding new ways to solve problems. Something like the 2x2 is, a very novel way of training weave poles. How do you approach problems in dog training?
That's a good question. I probably look at problems a little bit differently because, I get excited about the possibilities. So a problem gives you an avenue to growth. And so, you never say, I want more problems, but the overcoming a problem opens a new door to amazing possibilities that you didn't see before. And honestly, with my own dogs, the number of problems I see in my dog training is very, very small compared to maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And the problems, what I'm seeing now, are ways to help my students' dogs. And when we can unravel a challenge in one of their dogs, then that gives me insight into helping, hundreds of thousands of dogs all over the world. So, when I see something, it doesn't, you might think in the moment, that depresses you, but it really doesn't. And that's why you look at Buzzy, who is a very, very high drive border collie, and my very next dog, Decaf, was a dog who had some fear issues, dramatically different dogs, dramatically different challenges. And again, I don't look at them as problems, but as, ways of increasing the dog's confidence and increasing the understanding. And when I look back on what I did with those 2 dogs, I would, it was exhausting to even consider it. But in the midst of training those dogs, I never once regretted any part of it. I never once said, why do I have to have this dog? I just loved both of the dogs, and then it's overcoming it and looking back at it. It's like you've climbed a mountain, you're not realizing you're climbing, and then you get to the top and you look down at the view, and it's like, this is beautiful.
Right.
I can't believe what I've accomplished. And so that's the way I look at stumbling blocks, and it's exciting, it's motivating, and you shouldn't look at it as something that could defeat you and give up, and maybe this dog shouldn't be doing agility or whatever that sport is. Look at it as a way of opening up a brand new education to yourself as a trainer.
So we mentioned 2x2s. There's been lots of different people at the top doing running contacts. It's becoming more and more prevalent at Worlds, at Nationals, and then even on your kind of hobby competitor, starting to do running contacts. What do you think is the next thing?
Wow. My crystal ball's a little dusty right now, Sarah. You know what I think where there is a huge opportunity for advancement is in jump training.
Okay. Yeah.
That currently there's still a lot of, if there's the punishment that's used in agility is still used in jumping, and I really believe that punishment is used. There's that old expression. Punishment's used when knowledge ends. Punishment begins where knowledge ends, and so when we're using punishment in training, and those people that there's something you're taking away every time. You might take away the fact that the dog knocks bars, but you're also taking away some of that drive and speed. Mm-hmm. And so that would be a huge epiphany is the advent of getting a dog who jumps with amazing speed and drive all the way around the course. And keeping the bars up, because again, the reinforcement and the punishment. If you ignore the bars and you just let them run through, and you don't think they'll figure it out, then you might have a dog that blithers and goes crazy, but they don't have any control to be able to do their job well and keep the bars up. And the other side of it is if you use punishment and are consistently down on the dog that it's your fault, then the dog is going to slow down in order to achieve what you want. And the thing is, from where I sit, is if you use punishment in something like jump training, you're blaming the dog, and then there is no growth for you. Because it's nothing you could do, it's the dog's fault. Where I look at it that, there's still more for us to know and learn about getting a dog to jump an extension and cue collection and be able to turn into collection, but keep that at the speeds that you can chase a squirrel. Right. So really that's, we've got running contacts, we've got blistering weed pulls, and it's like fly ball. There's only so many behaviors that the dog needs to do, and how we get that faster. We get that faster, and I think the thing that's left for us in agility is getting those dogs to read distances, jump well, turn tightly when cued, and keep bars up.
Right, and the number of jumps compared to the number of dog walks.
And most people love training the sexy stuff with the dog walks.
And I think that when you look at agility competitors as an entire group, not just competitors at the top, I would say that most people address jumping when it becomes a problem, rather than making it part of their foundation for their dog. Exactly. So I think there is a lot of growth to be had there for all competitors.
Absolutely.
So you've been recognized as a leader in so many areas of dog training, from the 2x2 to recallers, running contacts. What are your current projects, and what do you have planned for 2014?
Well, obviously a lot of our work is online now. I still like to teach in person, which is why I'm down here in Texas, because I love working with students. But we have our next course will be our online handling class, where I'm going to go through how and why and what we're doing in our handling. I have a new book coming out this year. Okay. Yeah, I guess I can reveal it right here.
Yeah, do
on
it.
The podcast.
Yeah.
It's called The Amazing Stays.
Okay.
And it started off just as a little brochure for students, and it turned into, 150-page book. There's a lot to be said about getting a dog to want to stay in position, and there's a lot of dogs that don't hold stays. So it evolved into this huge project. So that should be coming out shortly, and working hard at another big online project, which I'm hoping to launch in the fall. And of course, we'll have recallers again this year. So the year is busy online, and I'm loving it. And but I still, I always have a ton of projects on the go.
Right. And this is your first time to do handling online, right? All of your other projects?
Absolutely, Sarah. This is my first time. I've been asked. I did a survey, I think 2 or 3 years ago. I asked for a survey from my online community, and by far the number one thing they wanted for me to put out was handling.
Right.
And I think following that, I put out a course on contacts. So I'm listening. Finally, I'm listening. So and now, because I'm super excited about how much fun all of my students are having with this handling, and how much success it's bringing them as well. So that's why I'm like, we got to do this handling class now.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Susan. And of course, people can find you on your website at susangarrettdogagility.com. And we will have a link to that on our podcast page as well, so people can easily find that. And at sayyes.com.
Sayyes.com is a porn site, Sarah.
Oh no!
Sayyes.ca will get you to our training site, and clickerdogs.com. People get that mixed up. You know what?
Right.
When I had Rough Love, and then we had Sayyes,
no.
it wasn't going in the right direction early on in our online education, but we got it straight. Thank you, Sarah. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let me redo
Come
that.
on, you can leave that in.
All right, fine. All right, well, thank you again, Susan.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.